through gender mainstreaming. So gender mainstreaming, remember, is a strategy. So after identifying those issues through gender analysis is when you incorporate those gender differences, gender inequalities into mainstreaming into the projects or programs that you have identified. Yeah. So let's look at the Harvard analytical framework. Just as I said, it has 4 main components, the gender analytical framework. So let's look at the components, main components of the Harvard analytical framework. So I've Harvard 2.1 is the activity profile. Activity profile. So now you need to relate it to what we've been discussing, because Harvard analytical framework is a framework under the gender analysis. We have different analytical gender analytical frameworks. So you realize most of the things that we were discussing in gender analysis there in the Harvard analytical framework. So just as I say, the first two is the activity profile. So these two identifies all relevant productive and reproductive tasks and answers the question, who does what? Remember, already discussed about who does what. Yeah? Activity profile, as you, even the word suggests, activities which are being undertaken. So it identifies all relative productive and reproductive tasks done by men and women. So it asks the question, who does what on those activities? If it's agricultural production, who does what? Who does weeding, land preparation, planting, weeding, harvesting, selling? Who does what? So how much detail you need depends on the nature of the project. So when you have a project, the activities that are there within the project, you need to ask yourself who does what. So the detail will depend on the nature of the project, because the projects will differ from one to another. So those areas of activity which the project will directly involved in, which the project will be directly involved in, require the greatest detail. For instance, an activity profile for agricultural project would list, according to the gender division of labor, each agricultural activity, such as land clearance, preparation, and so on, for each crop on each type of field, activity profile. So I think with this example, you understand better when we mean activity profile. The identify all the productive and reproductive tasks that will be conducted in that project. So if we are looking at an agricultural project, agricultural production, you look at who does what. So the activities which are there, like land clearance, land preparation, weeding, planting, fertilizer application, if it's a maize field, you need to specify who does what, who does land clearance, who does land preparation, who does weeding, who does selling, until maybe the selling part, harvesting, and then you sell if it's for selling. So you do this on for each crop. So if it's you have groundnuts, tobacco, whatever, you need to ask yourself who does what. If it's tobacco, kumakawanga nazareth. So you need to ask, who prepares the nursery, who manages the nursery, land preparation, planting, removing the suckers, whatever, all those activities which happens. So the activity profile, the detail of the information that you need depends on the nature of the project. So it means it will be different. So for agricultural project, it means you'll be listing all the activities that will be conducted on that project, and for each crop, because the activities will be different. For maize production and tobacco production, zosiyane kumakati maprocess tina nanga chimanga timabanga sona zalingati no kumakhala atuchosa masaka zikuyodoni kumakhala kumanga foja whatever kumakhala kulibe kweli. So you do it for each crop or each type of field, the activities which are happening in that kind of field. So that's the activity profile. So depending on the context, other parameters may also be examined. Apart from asking who does what, it means by who does what, the what will be the activities which will be conducted, and the who, it means who will be doing which activity. Then, depending on the nature of the project, you also consider other parameters such as gender and age denomination. Gender. So, for example, in terms of gender, if we're talking of women, women, are they adult women, adult men? Maybe it's boys or girls, children or elderly who will carry the activity. So who does what? I said, when I was talking about disaggregated data, I said males and females. If you say maybe 50% dropout rate in males and 20 in females. So I asked, like you say, it's not only about 50, 70. You can go further to within those girls, what age range? Or is it primary school, high school dropout in primary, secondary, whatever? So in this case, you're also considering gender and age denomination. Gender, if it's men, adult men, or young men, or the elderly, older men. You also consider time allocation for those activities. So time allocation specify what percentage of time is allocated to each activity, and whether it is carried out seasonally or daily. You specify time allocation in terms of agricultural production. What time is allocated to each activity? Planting in most cases, in one day, then we finish. Then it means we'll be waiting for weeding or whatever, or those other activities. So is it carried out seasonal or daily? For example, agricultural production is seasonal. After the rainy season, the work is over. So for each activity, it means you do that what time is allocated, percentage of time allocated for each activity. And also you specify the activity locus, where the activity is performed. Is it at home, in the field? Where is the activity performed? For example, in terms of tobacco production, but all the other activities will happen at home when it's selling in the market. So to specify where the activity is performed in order to review people's mobility, and is work done within the home, within the field, family shop, or elsewhere within the community. So those are the questions that you ask. So as I said, the Harvard Analytical Framework 2.1 is activity profile. The key word question is who does what. So the moment you remember who does what, means who is the person who is doing which activity. So you list all those activities and see who performs that activity. And then you also look at other parameters depending on the nature of the project, or the depending on the context. In terms of age, gender, young, old, time allocated to it. Is it done, like the location of the activity? Is it within the field, home, within the community? So this is about the activity profile. Four main components of Harvard Analytical Framework. Are we together? Versus at the end, I'll ask each one of you to tell me, like a brief, just briefly, what you understand by activity profile. By the moment we are leaving this hall, everyone should know. So, example of Harvard 2.1, for example, productive activities. Agriculture, activity 1, maybe is land clearance. You'll be putting a star. Is it done by women or girls, men or boys? Income generating activity, employment. So there are different activities. Can be agricultural activity, income generating activity in terms of business, maybe employment. So you need to indicate the activity in that business, in that income generating activity, in that agricultural activity. So you indicate, is it done by men or is done by women? So you need to indicate. Are we together? Can we proceed to component number 2? Can you try to briefly explain? Who can try, volunteer to briefly explain the activity profile? Just in brief. Try, Amikani. I know you will try. Trying is better than just staying quiet. You learn something, yeah. Eh? You didn't understand the table? I said just briefly what you understand by active component number 1, activity profile. What is it talking about? Activity profile. What is happening in that component, first component? 2, number 1, activity profile. You remember, the first thing is to ask yourself who does what. It means you are listing the activities and see who is performing which activity. This is the basic thing that you need to get from the activity profile. So all the other explanations will be just as an example, as I gave agricultural productivity. But the main point is who does what. By just asking yourself who does what already. Who person who does what, the activity. It means you are listing all the activities and see who is doing which activity. On activity profile, who does what, and then depending on context, you go deeper to look at other parameters. Where does this activity happen? Is it within the home? Time, which time taken to complete the activity. Is it seasonally? Is the activity done daily or throughout the year? You also look at age specifications, adults. So who does what? So this is something which should lead you to the point number 2, number 1. Who does what? So by saying who does what, I'm sure we already remember everything that we have discussed. Activity number 2, Harvard 2, number 2, which is access and control profile, which is in terms of resources and benefits. Access and control profile. So this 2 enables users to list what resources people use to carry out the activities, the tasks identified in the activity profile. So list activities, or say you have listed all the activities and who does what, who is doing this activity. Number 2, it will help you list activities, list resources that people will use to manage those activities. For example, here, activity number 1, production, activity number 1, assuming it's land preparation. So you need to identify resources needed to do land preparation. You need to identify resources in order to do maybe weeding. Resources, maybe there's fertilizer application. What resources? So Harvard 2, number 2 enables users to list what resources people use to carry out the tasks identified in. Identify my activity. You get my point. Now my resources are activity. Which resource or what resources are needed to complete those tasks? So it indicates whether women or men have access to resources, who controls their use, who controls the benefits of the household use of resources. So you list all those resources, then you ask who controls these resources or who has access to these resources. Because at first you just be listing land preparation. You need land, you need equipment. Maybe it's a hoe, maybe it's tractors, whatever equipment that you are using. Number 2, you list the resources needed for each activity. So for all those resources, you need to ask yourself who has access to these resources, who controls the use of resources. If you have land, maybe the issues of labor, who controls land? Maybe issue of fertilizer or seeds, who controls, or who controls the benefits of household use of resources. This is, leave out your phones, all of you guys. Everyone is on the phone. Leave out your phones. You are all on the phones. Otherwise, I don't say it means I'm just labeling in vain. So let's focus on whatever we are discussing. Let's leave out the phones. If you want to be on the phone, you can go out. Maybe for a few minutes. When you are done, you can come back. Yeah. So number 2, you list resources, then you need to know whether these resources, who has control or who has access to these resources, who controls the use, who controls the benefits. Point activity number 2, Harvard 2, number 2. So access simply means that you are able to use a resource, but it says nothing about whether you have control over it. Sometimes when you have access, you are able to use a resource. Do you have access to resources? You can have access, able to use, but maybe you can say nothing about it. You have no say, you have to use it for mass production. Inosigala makaula. Room 3 munalide muli muntu alwamu? Oh, sorry for that. Yeah. So access simply means you're able to use a resource, but it does not say if you have any control over that resource. You can use land, but you have control over that land. That's a question that Harvard 2, number 2 tries to answer. For example, women may have access to local political processes, but little influence or control over which issues are discussed and the final decisions. You may have access to local political processes, maybe there are meetings, whatever, but you can take part in maybe political meetings, but maybe have less influence or control over the decisions which are made there. But they can be there, but do they have control? Do they have influence over the decisions which are made in that political meeting? That's another question. So Harvard 2, number 2 will deal with the issues of access and control profile, which focuses on access and control over resources, benefits, which reaped from that project. So the person who controls a resource is the one ultimately able to make decisions about its use, including whether it can be sold or not. You see now the issue of control. You can have access, but what about control? So Harvard Analytical Frameworks on the component number 2 tries to see if the resources needed, for example, is land. Maybe you have access to land, uri mulimi. Kama mulindi control over that land on what to use with that land. It means you don't have control over that land, but you have access. Or maybe you have land control. You can have access to that land, but when it comes to decisions, tugulise maro madam. Decision this is a final say. We are selling this land. That's controlling, yeah. So component number 2 looks at access and control of resources. Who controls the resources? So it means you are listing all the resources used and then look at who controls the benefits, the use, access, whatever, or who has more influence on it. Yeah. So here is the example of Harvard 2, access and control. It means the resources, for example, land. Who has access? Is it men or women? So you'll be putting a star here. Maybe resources, you have land. Maybe women have access, you put a star, men have access. What about control? Because here you can have land, women having access, men having access, but what about control? Do both men and women have control? You may realize you're only putting a star here on control. The same with equipment. When I'm using my equipment is my sprayer, whatever. Access. Do men and women have access? So it means you'll be putting a star here. If they both have access to equipment, you just be putting a star? Yeah, it means land. Men have access. You put a star here. Men have access. Women have access. You put a star here. You put a star here. When it comes to control, who has more control over land? So it means you only put a star on the men and dash. It means women don't have control, but they have access. The same with equipment. Let's take a tractor. Do women have access to tractors? Dash. Do men have access to tractors? Yes. What about control? You find control. It means if they don't have access, they don't have control. It means here you put a star on access for men and control for men. What about cash? Do women have access to cash? Yes. It means men and both men and women have access. When it comes to control, men. Yeah, that's how you use the Harvard analytical. It means yeah, of course it depends. That's why in most cases when you have a figure or whatever, to deal with such issues, because if it's a woman, it means you just have a yeah, depending on that activity you are dealing with. Yeah. So in terms of benefits, in terms of outside income, who has access between men and women? Then you look at control, asset ownership. Who has access? Basic needs. Maybe also that means muzika star said. You put a star here, you put a star here. It control gada mai saba ngabakala dash bakagabwet. I mean who controls, you find is only a man. Political power, you need realize access. Maybe a woman has access, as I said here. Good, maybe sometimes they have access to local political processes, but no little influence or control over issues to be discussed. So it means in terms of political power and prestige, they may have access to men and women. Control only men. Kavesesane? Yeah. Are we together? Have a two, number 3, influencing factors now. Influencing factors. So this 2 allows you to chart factors which influence the differences in gender division of labor, access and control as listed in the 2 profiles 1 and 2. So these 2 allows you to chart which factors influence the differences in division of labor. So wayambirira kunalinga activity amapanga ndi ndani koma now you need to malemba activities ajet. Now you will look at influencing factors. Simapanga influence kuti azimai okha ndamene mwina azigwira activity iyi that mean ndi ndani. You get my point? Like the influencing factors. So allows you to chart factors which influences the gender division of labor as we discussed in profile 1, 2, number 1, and also access and control as listed in 2. So now what factors, as you said, in terms of equipment, we said equipment in most cases, for example, tractors, men no access or access but no control. So what factors influences they may be to have only access or no control? So that's what we'll be looking at. Couldn't you my factors are they should access the cash, or maybe they should not, they have access to cash, but they should not control the cash. The influencing factors will also look here, like the activities. My factors are land preparation as my. What about selling? Selling in Chifana. You realize some activities will be done by both men and women. Doesn't mean all agricultural activities are done by women. Yeah. So what factors? So it means you'll be looking at what factors influences this division of labor. What factors? And here as well, what factors affect access and control to these resources? These men have access to land but no control over land, while men has access and control over this land. So Harvard 2.3 looks at those influencing factors. What factors influences them? So identifying past and present influences can give an indication of future trends. So you are trying to identify the past and present influences, issues of culture, beliefs, whatever, maybe education levels. So those are some of the issues that can influence the access and control and also division of labor. So these factors must be considered because they present opportunities and constraints to increasing the involvement of women in development projects and programs. Now you see the relationship. We are looking at these factors because they are the ones that they represent the opportunities and constraints in terms of access and control. If you look at those factors, if something maybe educational level hinders them to have access to income, now you are looking at this, it represents itself as a constraint. So these factors must be considered because they represent opportunities and constraints to increasing involvement, because maybe you have some constraints in terms of access to land, control of resources. It affects these women in participation, women's involvement in development projects. Are we together? Yeah. Maybe akulephera kupanga participate in terms of division of labor. Kumunda tikungwapasa ntchito zonse okha. It represents a constraint because they don't have time to participate in development projects. So what factors will be mapping out those factors that influences that kind of division of labor? Is it culture? Yeah. So influencing factors include all those that shape gender relations and determine different opportunities and constraints for men and women. So some of them include community norms and social hierarchies, demographic conditions such as age, education can be an influencing factor. I think I gave an example of education. Schools unapite. So if we are talking in terms of access to land, oloba banja ilikakosa prinzira ndio karusu mangajicho so that generate any income. Maloro amakhanze bambo oloba banja kuthereshicho so lembesa muzina lake iwe like there is nothing. So we are looking at those factors. Demographic conditions in terms of age and education, institutional factors in terms of nature of government bureaucracies and arrangements for generation and dissemination of technology, general economic conditions as well. These are also factors, general economic conditions, poverty levels, inflation rates, income distribution, international terms of trade and infrastructure. So these are the factors which can influence maybe access and control to resources or access and control of benefits, or even influence division of labor. Poverty influences division of labor. How do poverty influences division of labor? Yeah. Maybe you don't have the skill needed to perform other kind of activities. Skills. What else? Even in terms of education, how do education influences division of labor? School. When you never went to school. So this is what we are talking about. These are the questions you need to be asking yourself. What about land? In terms of beliefs, how do beliefs influences access and control of resources? They embedded in our cultures, things which are not easy. Land imapita kwa jeni, like lineage imakhala kwa azimayi, zinthu zikupita kuti ndi kumwera. Kukhala kumpoto is about the men who controls land, who have ownership of land. So you need to be asking yourself these questions in this point. You can see they are feeding into each other. So you need to understand the whole flow, Yeah. So in terms of factors, internal and external political events, legal parameters, sometimes legal parameters also influences. In terms of policies, how do policies influences access and control, training and education, attitude of community to development. Attitude of community to development can also influence division of labor, and access and control of resources. So the purpose of identifying these influencing factors is to consider which ones affect women and men's activities or resources. Which factors affect men and women? Mwina my values, for example, they may influence division of labor or access to resources. If we value men in my society, I like men. Then mwina banchito tima prestigious jobs you want to give them to men. So it helps to consider which factors influence men's and women's activities and resources, and how they in turn affect them. So this tool is intended to help you identify external constraints and opportunities, which you should consider in planning your development interventions. You need to consider if it's the issues of culture. When you are planning your development interventions, you need to consider if women want to participate in a certain project, but they have certain influencing factors, maybe in terms of education. Those are considered. What are you going to do to make sure they benefit equally same as men in that kind of project? Otherwise, they'll be left out. In terms of beliefs, maybe you need to conduct sensitization meetings first to change the mindset of the people. So it's like you are identifying intended constraints and opportunities. Actually, I think in terms of factors, it doesn't mean only negative. In terms of education, it means there are certain opportunities that you can get. Despite that, I've just looked, my examples are just based on the negatives. It means even women, you can be on higher positions if you are in terms of division of labor. Maybe you'll be in an office working or doing something else. Right? Yeah. So now, I think this is just to help you understand the table. We are looking at influencing factors. There are so many in terms of community norms and social hierarchy. Is it a constraint or an opportunity? Demographic factors, institutional structures, economic factors, maybe in terms of poverty, it will be a constraint. Demographic factors like education, this one can be an opportunity if you are educated. If you are not, it will be a constraint maybe to do other things. Trainings, this one definitely. If you have access to a training, this will be an opportunity for you to do some things in your project. Are we together on the third point? Influencing factors. Can we move to component number 3? Yamkan seems lost. Are you lost? Nzimwera mazi. Ma constraints nzolepheresa, ma opportunities zimene zimakupatsa mwayi upanga chinthu china. Ndimi nzolepheresa, sina zikhala zolepheresa apa. Economic factors, poverty. Poverty sometimes can be a constraint, right? In terms of access and control, ikhayolepheresa. Mazathu amaponderezedwa because of poverty. That's what it means. In terms of education, if you are illiterate, sudaphunzire. Education ukakhala ophunzira, it will be an opportunity. When you do not, it will be a constraint. So mukapanga map zinthu zija, find maybe poverty here, it's a constraint. Anthu akulephera kupeza ma opportunities ena chifukwa cha poverty. They are failing to have access to land and resources. Mamizitu chifukwa chake anthu mamezi akugulitsa timalo mosadziwika bwino. Mkwabera direct kulende kuti. Because of the illiterate, ukhala munthu wanzeru, you value land. So constraint is zolepheresa. Ziwalepheresa ndi chani? To have access to resources, or to have access to benefits in terms of community norms, norms of the community and social hierarchy. Imapangitsa aswe kuti maybe it can be a constraint. Ulepheresa kuti mwina ukapanga access china chake ma resources. And some of these will be constraints. Some of them present themselves as opportunities. Education, munthu aphunzire, it will be an opportunity. In terms of division of labor, ukagwira kachiro leno lake, malo mukagwira khasu. Mwina wenda mozo kanisa chitrekera. Tamvesesane? Yeah. Izibwera kuti community norms yabwera ngati constraint. Yabwera as opportunity. You'll be marking. Oh. Constraint X. So demographic factors, of course, this is it because in terms of demographic factors, we're talking of age, is a demographic factor, gender, whatever. So it's a age, comma in terms of age mwino wakhaso mwana it can be a constraint tawizinete sinangatha kuti kuponderezana eti kana so zingobanga this is an opportunity pa your market. I would encourage you to read next week. Aliyesaza ndifotokozere kumene zonse koma mukawerenga. It's next week's class. It's for your own benefit, not my benefit. So at home, sometimes when we give you such assignments, at home magarizo jomba usabanga, not knowing it will help you. Yeah. So the last two, Harvard 2 is checklist for project analysis, project cycle analysis. Checklist for project cycle analysis. This consists of a series of questions. So these are designed to assist you to examine the project proposal or an area of intervention from the agenda perspective. Checklist for project cycle analysis. So they are designed to assist you to examine a project proposal. These questions when you have the project that you want to implement. So it will help you to examine the area of intervention from a gender perspective using gender disaggregated data and capturing the different effects of social change on men and women. Now we are trying to design a program to make sure it's gender sensitive. You're incorporating the issues of gender. So this uses the disaggregated data because kwambira kujarimati who does what, it means mupangakale magawakalete akupanga mbiri ndazi mai akupanga ndazi bambo akupanga mbiri ndazi mai or zina kupanga ose. It doesn't mean it's not everything inapanga azimai ukauka kanya azibambo zina mzori ose akuda nakupanga. So the following set of questions are key ones for each of the 4 main stages. As I said, it's project cycle analysis. So project cycle is composed of identification, design, and evaluation. You are trying to check if those issues were incorporated. So assessing women's needs in terms of project identification. Mafuso wa mafusa bajene ina ili yose, stage ili yose, project cycle. Kumaka project identification, designing, implementation, and evaluation. It's a cycle, right? Makangere ambilaso. So you ask questions. So women's dimensions in project identification, right? So you assess women's needs. What needs and opportunities exist for increasing women's productivity and production? What needs and opportunities exist for women's access to and control of resources? What needs and opportunities exist for increasing women's access to and control of benefits? You are checking on each stage. How do these needs and opportunities relate to countries' other general and sectoral development needs and opportunities? Have women been directly consulted in identifying such needs and opportunities? Identification, project identification. Yeah. So in a series of questions, question mbili which helps you to examine the project proposal from a gender perspective. Now you are looking at the gender perspective to see if the both you are trying to assess the needs of women during the identification stage. You are identifying which project should you implement. So what needs and opportunities exist for increasing women's productivity? What needs? So ndishachitali because ukamaliza ndi project identification my questions wandambisi namalize. I already sent the document, but I will send you the whole document. I think it's about 4 or 5 pages. Couldn't get my slide. There's project identification, umakafika soba designing, and you start asking these questions to assess the incorporation of gender perspective in the design, implementation, and evaluation. So this one is just a checklist. So it composed of series of questions for each of the 4 main stages. My stages I'm talking about, but the main stages are 4: identification, design, implementation, and evaluation. During identification of the project design with the mafuso, implementation up to evaluation. Zuzu to maswa. Tilimodi. Then next week I will need a summary. This summary, I don't need a big summary. You know what you said? Just a statement that will help me to see if you have really understood. For example, I talked of Harvard 2 number 1 activity profile. Who does what? In terms of list activities or who is doing this activity, the age, division, like time allocation, like just in short, even 2-3 sentences on each, maybe even two sentences per activity. I mean per 2, I'm okay. Because I'm just checking your understanding. Mother Joyce. Tamfana za gender analysis. Urashedwa. Komande apa baligwira chijeni chiri uku libe boyika. Bati yanga ita bompana. Ndekina kusimuziona atu. Isi yayikulu. It's about gender budgeting. Ndeti panga bwanji chijeni chiri uku. Laptop yathu ifunika moto tipite uku. Gender budgeting. Kura? Kuli Jen? Kuli mapoa? I don't know. I hope you fit. Ndibatero basiko? Oh. I think so. Yeah. Wow, better. Nanga zinthu zake zimenezo saoneso ngati gender analysis osaona riyo fotokoze. What is gender budgeting? Iwe ulikhalisa pa phone. What is gender budgeting? Leave your phone. Kulito mndu akamukhala phone sasowa. Ndipo ora mabisi ndendi kuzibe machitiketi ukamabisa pamomuonekera. Munapanga noti munthu amene wangokhala kungopanga zimuoneka za normal. Then wina achire kafoni pika kupasa. Mulezo zimezi ari uli challenge. Wabisa uli class umuonekera nsanga. Then mwina amene munthu wangokhala wangolemba. So what is gender budgeting?
Strategy to achieve equality.
Strategy to achieve equality between men and women by focusing on how public resources are collected and spent. Yeah. Strategy to achieve equality between women and men by focusing on how public resources are collected and spent. Yeah. So gender budgeting is an approach to budgeting that can improve it when fiscal policies and administrative procedures structure to address gender inequality. So the aim of gender budgeting, it means we are incorporating the aspects of gender even when we are making our budgets. Right? So to make sure that the public resources, how the public resources are collected and spent, do not necessitate or aggravate the gender inequalities, but rather solve or promote gender equality. Resources should be spent with the aim of promoting gender equality. So when properly done, one can say that gender budgeting is good budgeting when it's properly done. So according to the Council of Europe, it defines gender budgeting. Joy. According to the Council of Europe, defines gender budgeting as a gender-based assessment of budgets, incorporating a gender perspective at all levels of the budgetary processes. Incorporating gender perspective at all levels of the budgetary process and restructuring revenues and expenditure to promote gender equality. So gender budgeting is its main goal is to promote gender equality as well. Yeah. So the purpose of gender budgeting is to promote accountability and transparency in fiscal planning. Promoting accountability and transparency increase gender responsive participation in the budget process. To increase gender responsive participation in the budget process, for example, by undertaking steps to involve women and women equally in budget preparation. Gender responsive participation in the budget process. When you are making a budget, you make sure both men, when preparing a budget, both men and women are included. So increase gender responsive participation. So imagine if you have issues concerning women, it means the women will be like, no, yeah. And to advance gender equality and women's rights. So to advance gender equality and women's rights, increase gender responsive participation in the budget process, promote accountability and transparency. Those are the purposes of gender budgeting. Biririre? Uyane head? Hey, zina langu bwana mpandika ngoliona nimango lisia. Hey, kaya mama ngapo na usibwaji. Yeah. So by this is just the explanation, integrating gender budgeting methodology into the ordinary budgetary processes allows governments to better understand how revenue and spending and the policies guiding the budget can have different impacts on men and women. Because how the budget is prepared, the policies guiding the budget can also have an impact on men and women, have different impacts. So it helps to understand how revenue and spending and also the policies guiding the budget. Because when I'm making a budget, it's guided by a policy. So it guides the policies guiding the budget and have different impacts on men and women, how the policy is crafted. So if it doesn't favor women, it means it impacts women differently or negatively. So since gender perspectives are normally normally not taken into account in budgeting, budgets are often perceived as being neutral. In most cases, when coming up with a budget, gender perspective is not taken into account. As a result, we just perceive or just think the budget is gender neutral. Perception, but when it's not gender neutral. However, research shows that lack of attention to gender issues actually leads to gender blind budgets. You remember gender blindness? I don't know, we discussed gender blindness. Yeah. So lack of attention to gender issues actually leads to gender blind budgets and therefore to suboptimal decision making. So if you don't do gender budgeting, if you don't pay attention to gender issues, it can lead to gender blind budgets if you don't pay particular attention. Gender blindness. If you have forgotten, revisit our first slides, first lecture, kumapeto. Kandi 60 slides described all these things, gender blind budgets. Because you do not take into consideration or attention of the gender issues. So when gender budgeting is grounded in gender analysis, gender analysis, why you need to understand gender analysis. Gender budgeting is grounded in gender analysis, which assesses how well a budget addresses gender gaps. Gender analysis. Gender analysis, as I said, helps to identify the gender gaps. So it assesses how well Budget addresses the gender gaps. It means if you identify these gender gaps, that's when you mainstream those gaps into the policies and programs. So addresses gender gaps and review the actual distribution of resources between women and men, girls and boys. So it assesses how well a budget addresses gender gaps, the gender analysis, and it reviews the actual distribution of resources between men and women, boys and girls. Gender analysis is the actual distribution of resources between men and women, boys and girls. So if you realize maybe the distribution is unfair, that's when gender budgeting will deal with the unfairness of this distribution of resources. If you remember the definition, we said focusing on how public resources are collected and spent. So if they are not well used, like if it's not, the budget does not consider the gender perspective, it means one gender can be impacted negatively. Sinanga zikungobanga consider one gender. Ena wana arailidwa. Maybe let's talk of health issues. But my health issues na which amabanga affect my women na ngali reproductive health. Mina pa gender budgeting, you did not consider, as we said, you need to consider in gender budgeting, you need to consider the women in gender budgeting. So to increase gender responsive participation in budget process, for example, undertaking steps to involve women and men equally in the budget preparation. So when it comes here, the distribution of resources in terms of healthy department, we have different problems which affect men and women. We have issues to do with reproductive health. It means those issues need to be incorporated when allocating your budget, when doing budget allocations. My issues because we have some certain health issues which affect men, which affect women different. Reproductive health problems, they affect women, not men. Yeah. So such an analysis allows for the inclusion of key issues that are frequently overlooked in budget. Our example is health and policy analysis, such as the economic effect of an uneven distribution of unpaid work and its net economic effect on women, as well as the uneven distribution of resources within families. The analysis inclusion of key issues, some of the key issues which are overlooked in the budget. So after gender analysis, you have identified those key issues that you need to incorporate in gender budgeting. So such as the economic effect of uneven distribution of unpaid work. You know, unpaid work usually is done mostly by women. As mama grandchildren, from morning to evening. Osapuma kutuka mamawa 4 o'clock arelege maji asampisana bali mara zimaisara. It's work, but it's unpaid work. So sound gender analysis lead to good planning and budgeting for gender equality and economic growth. Mazola mezi ubangira feed into each other. Good sound gender analysis leads into good planning and gender budgeting for gender equality and economic growth. So gender analysis is very important. It helps in gender budgeting, gender mainstreaming, to deal with gender equality. So importantly, gender budgeting is about restructuring the budget to ensure that the government is using public resources in a way that can increase gender equality. Gender budgeting. You restructure the budget. If you feel like a certain segment of the society is not benefiting from that budget, you need to restructure. So restructuring the budget to ensure that government is using public resources which promotes gender equality and thereby increase the efficiency and effectiveness of budgets and policies. Everyone should benefit. So it should incorporate the issues concerning men and women. So this in turn accelerates inclusive and sustainable growth, inclusive growth, because everyone, tiyagereza example ya mukubanga budget is an if most women who do, maybe they do reproductive work, who are usually working in the private sphere, mabwela maloni manifu mona, I think ejima jwaso budget yaikulu iti abirise kunifu kwambiri azimai ambiri ana makungu okhala manyumba amo azipanga kuti ma business ere. So it means gender budgeting, you be including those women when making your budget. I hear nifi kwambiri amapindula kwambiri ndazimai ere, and now azimai they should start their own businesses for economic growth. So it helps to accelerate inclusive and sustainable growth, sustainability, because everyone is taking part in development. So gender budgeting can be applied at different levels. Gender budgeting. That's why we have national budget. This is at a higher level. Timakadi national budget. Jambi banga publish mu news. Tose timawelenga. Shima banga trend. Bali bose. Ona banga allocate kwa mbili u. Kuhefe kumashebesa. So gender budgeting can be applied at different levels. So it can be at central government level, the national budgets, amabangibwa central, amabanga ku health, kubita is ku education, kubita is ku gender, kubita is HIV, kubita is, and so on and so forth. So introducing gender budgeting at central level is important because budgetary decisions on both revenue and expenditure are made at this level. Gender budgeting at this level. If you're talking of revenue, collection are done at central government level, and even expenditures are made at this level. Budgetary allocations are done at central level. Then we have, this is a gender budgeting at central level. Then we have gender budgeting at regional and local levels, regional and local levels. So why at regional and local levels? Because of the proximity to the people, the local government levels. So regional and local governments' proximity to people's everyday lives means there is potential to respond more directly to women's and men's needs. You are in direct contact with these people, unlike at the central level. But at regional and local levels, you are in direct contact with the with women's and men's needs, to women's and men's who are affected. So when it comes to public policy and service delivery, masiku ano baja budget, if akapanga ma budget aja panjangati masala ya leti ma civil servant pana macho pa district level, mukapeza kuti aphunzitsi ena alandira pa 27 boma lina, ena alandira pa 30 boma lina, ena mpaka mademo pa 7 boma lina. Because like gender budgeting, which is at regional and local levels. Yeah. So at this level, there is greater potential to use participatory gender budgeting approaches involving the local population. At these local government levels, it's easier to involve or to do participatory gender budgeting processes. Pameneza kumamba zijazimangorengera ma position eti amene ayenera akapezeke kumene kucha basi. 5 minutes break. I know you guys are tired. Class is up with the hygiene. 5 minutes break it. Tapanga ko pause. It is well. It is well. Yeah, so are we together on the concept of gender budgeting? Who can try just to explain in your own understanding of gender budgeting, in your own words, like the concept of gender budgeting? All I want is the concept. If you have really understood the concept of gender budgeting. We are.
So gender budgeting, this Uh, Bueno,